Thank you all so much for joining Luxury Institute's webinar on the highly profitable journey from privileged access to advanced personalization. Today we have 11-year Google veteran and GLIAnet Project founder Richard Whitt, along with DigiMe Executive Chairman, founder Julian Ranger, and Luxury Institute CEO Milton Pedraza. They will share insights as to how brands can gain privileged access to rich client data in order to achieve advanced personalization and deep loyalty, as well as provide recommendations to create real breakthrough business models post-pandemic. A few things: today's webinar is being recorded and will be shared via email after the session. The recording will also be available on Luxury Institute's YouTube channel after today's session. Please feel free to share your questions using the Q&A box located on your Zoom screen. We will address as many questions as possible during the last 15 minutes of today's session. If you would like to connect privately to ask any questions or to share your feedback, or would like us to make an introduction to our speakers, please feel free to contact us. Now I would like to introduce you to our moderator, Luxury Institute CEO, Milton Pedraza.
Thank you, Katie. I'm excited about this topic, and I want to thank you for joining us today. I have two very special guests, two people whom I admire and respect greatly, and I want to introduce them. First, Julian Ranger. Please share a little bit about your journey and your career and your personal life that we want to know about, how you got into this topic of the personal data economy. Julian?
Hi, everyone. So I'm Julian Ranger, as said, the exec chairman and founder of DigiMe. So I have a long networks, data and interoperability background, having been a key builder of the military internet for over 20 years before I sold my first business to the world's largest military company, Lockheed Martin, back in 2005. So a strange start to looking at consumers and data. But that experience of data interoperability led me to found DigiMe a few years ago, which is actually based on a lot of the learnings from that time, but on the premise that the individual is the only person who can truly aggregate rich data about themselves. Only I know everything about me. So if we want rich data, which is single source, wide in categories such as health, financial, social, purchases, and more, deep in time, accurate from source, then you have to come to me because I'm the only place. So we facilitate individuals to share this rich data with businesses to allow businesses to provide more and better value with, and very important today, privacy, security, and consent. And of course, we're going to discuss more of these concepts as we go through the day. But the key point I'd like to make up front is that in the new world, any data is available from the individual, but then the value exchange becomes the key aspect. What value is provided to me in exchange for the data I'm sharing? And that value is a service, convenience, or reward. So for me personally, enabling a new ethical world of an advanced data sharing is just a dream, really. We can do everything we want to do ethically and this is really key, profitably for us as businesses and for the individual. So that's me. Thank you very much, Milton.
Thank you, Julian. And now Richard Whitt. Tell us a little about yourself, Richard, please.
Thanks, Milton. It's great to be here today with two entrepreneurs I greatly respect, Julian and Milton. So look forward to the conversation. I arrived here after roughly a 3 decades career as a public policy attorney, first in private practice, then 12 years at MCI Communications, and over 11 years with Google. And one of the things that really struck me as I went through that career, and particularly the last several years at Google, was the immense importance of trust and trustworthiness, and how you create business models and relationships with customers and clients and patrons and clientele through various ways of expressing your trust with them, building relationships that are founded on that. As was mentioned at the top, I started this new project I call GLIAnet. People ask me, what the heck does that mean? Well, glia is the ancient Greek word for glue. And actually in there are sort of the 3 elements of the things I think are particularly important for the digital economy. The first is this idea that, of course, trust is the social glue that binds us together. It's a famous phrase. Many people have been attributed for it. But the point is relationships. It's about trust between myself, within my circle of family and friends, and with the institutions and entities with whom I choose to do my business on a daily basis. Without that trust, we don't have that relational value. Second is the notion of accountability. And I go back to the Spider-Man movies, some of you may be familiar with great trust, with great power comes great responsibility, right? And so in the digital economy, I feel like increasingly, particularly in my latter days at Google, we're treated as users, not as clients. And being a user means you don't have the same kind of status. And you don't have, among other things, this notion of accountability to the entity with whom I'm doing business. And so I feel like we need to bring those two elements back together again, of accountability and the power that comes with having access to my personal data. And the third piece of GLIAnet is the idea of support. The glial cells in the brain, many people are not as familiar with them as they are with neurons, which get much more of the fame. Neurons are immensely important, obviously, but the glial structures in the brain, they do protection, they promote, they enhance the facilitation of all the activities of neural structures. And so as much as we need the neurons, we very much, in equal measure, need the glial cells. And so I feel like that notion of support, providing that level of support to entities we work with and with the customers that we deal with on a daily basis, that's sort of a third aspect of GLIAnet. So those are sort of three of the elements coming from my career that have brought me to this point today.
Thank you, Richard. You know, and as I was thinking about doing this webinar, I took myself back to the year 2000, when I was the business leader for the first global CRM project for Citibank, Citigroup at the time. And then after that, for another multinational conglomerate called Centric. And I was trying to think back, why did CRM never live up to the promise? Here we are in 2020, and CRM has not lived up to its promise. And I realized that there were three missing elements as I thought about it. First, we had a lot of technology, but what we didn't have was the culture, the customer-centric culture, and that emotional intelligence to build client relationships. So that was missing ingredient number one, the culture. The second ingredient that I think will surprise you is that we didn't have great quality data. We were Citibank, so we were your bank, and we were one of the most intimate relationships, your banking relationships. But about 25 to 30% of our data was incomplete, unusable, obsolete, inaccurate, really, really poor data, what we called at the time dirty data. So that was a huge obstacle. And then the third missing link was that even though we used genetic algorithms and neural networks, and think of a cake as the analogy. So we had a one-layer cake in terms of algorithms and the ability to create the models that tell us what should we do as a cross-sell or an upsell. But what we were missing was the algorithms, the AI, and the computational power to use on our data. The point is that today in 2020, we do have the culture, we do have the access to the data, and that's what we'll talk about today. And we do have the computational and the algorithmic power to create deep, rich personalization. Now, as we created the content for this webinar, we realized that a lot of people are saying, okay, but give us the how-to. And so we, over the last 3 years at Luxury Institute, have been researching, investing. Full disclosure, I'm an investor in DigiMe. We've been trying to build critical relationships, such as the one with Julian and Richard. And we've been trying to build up the expertise. So when people come to us, we will be able to share, how do we take this journey? How do we navigate this highly profitable journey? And so what we created was this 10-step process that we had Julian and Richard do the vetting for. And I'm going to share with you, we're going to go over the 10-step process. I'm just going to read off the title, and then I'm going to ask Richard and Julian to weigh in based on the expertise that they have in each particular step. So let me start with this framework, this 10-step process. And step number one is to identify the most valuable customer data based on your brand, based on your category, based on your objective, your business model. And so why don't you please weigh in, Richard and Julian. Julian, you first, on how do we identify the most valuable customer data to get this process going?
So there's three things that I'd say. The first is you've got to think about your value exchange. You have to work that out. That drives the data need. So what are you offering as a result? So I'll stay in a medical frame, for example. If you've got a diabetes and you want to help me understand with relation to me, you might say, well, to improve the results, I need your wearables data. Okay, so that's what you need. Then open your mind. Almost any data can be available from the individual. So you'll have been used to thinking, well, I've only got this small piece of first party data, or I could get this from a third party. But when you go to the individual, almost any data is available. Now, whether I'll share it with you depends upon the value exchange. So therefore, you need to build a ladder of trust. Start simple. Give me some value for some data, then add more value for more data. So don't ask for everything up front. Don't ask for all my health, all my finance, all my social, all my purchases, because I probably haven't built that trust with you. But you can get any data, you can build that ladder of trust, but think about what is it that you can most provide value to me, and look at that value exchange and then go from there.
Thank you, Julian. Richard?
Yeah, thanks. So I guess the key takeaway I would suggest here for step one is not to think about data as a thing. It's actually a relational construct, right? And here in the Valley, you know, the saying, data is the new oil, right? Well, it's actually not. It's a process. It's a set of experiences. It's very relational and it's contextual. And in addition, the notion of oil is it's a limited resource, right? It's something you use once and you're done with it. Data is very different than that. It's what the economists call non-rivalrous use. What does that mean? Well, basically it means the more you share it, the more value you get out of it. So one entity getting access to one piece of data or one flow of data, let's say, there's a certain value. But if you add that to other data and share with several other entities, the value exchange literally explodes, because that's the way you tap into the richness of this thing, this construct, this set of flows. So in my work with GLIAnet, I call this the digital life streams. And it's also not homogeneous, right? Data is a mix of elements of the somatic, so it's my body, it's elements about myself, my DNA, my facial characteristics, for example. It's the institutional, it's my driver's license number. It's the social, you know, what's my favorite Monty Python television episode? And it's the internal. What is that unexpressed hope or aspiration for that cool family vacation this October in Greece? And that last piece in particular, in the current construct we have today, as we'll get into during the conversation, many of the companies who claim to have access to our data don't have access to that particular thing, my future intentionality. And that's one of the elements you can unlock over time if you build that trust relationship with your clients.
Thank you. So that's step one, to identify the most valuable customer data. Step two, and this is where Richard's expertise comes in heavily, is to install the legal and ethical framework for data sharing. So tell us a little bit about that, Richard. How do we create that framework?
So the law is what's required. So it's what we know of from the GDPR, which is the data regulations in Europe and now in California. The ethical is what's right. And I think what part of the thesis of our conversation today is to do the ethical, do what's actually right by your customers. And in many ways, that's the easiest path, right? If you don't have to hire a raft of attorneys to parse the terms of the GDPR or the California law, create detailed compliance plans, may or may not pass muster with regulators and courts, ethical thinking guides you to the business models that fully respect the individual and her needs and wants and aspirations. The ethical is what you layer on top of the legal. And I say this as a lawyer. So when it comes to our digital selves and our living trails of data, I see this as really a form of stewardship. This is a concept that comes in the natural world, right, as an extension or reflection of our humanity. We should have a similar attitude of caring and respect for the integrity of the digital self. One example quickly, I've talked about adopting a three-stage process of providing more ethical services to individuals based on fiduciary obligations: duty of care, a duty of loyalty, which says no conflicts, and a heightened duty of loyalty, which says to respect and promote the best interests of the individual, of the client or customer. And that's one way to become a fiduciary, adopting one of these common laws, similar to becoming a doctor or a lawyer or certain kinds of financial advisors. You can take on that heightened role, that ethical duty towards your customers or clients, and use that as the basis for your business model.
Thank you, Richard. So, you know, in our white paper, we said that being ethical and legal and serving the interests of your customers isn't complicated. It's really super simple to do the right thing when you're a trustworthy brand. And I think that's really important. I'm going to go to step three. And step three, Julian, is about establishing the technology framework for data sharing. So tell us a little bit about what the technology, the Lego set, what does that look like in order to facilitate that data share, please?
Okay, so you need to obviously define the data. That was step one, right, from the value exchange. Then you need to decide two things. What algorithm are you going to need? And we can talk a little bit more about those algorithms downstream. But where are you going to process the data? Are you going to do it on device? Because you're now asking the individual for the data. You don't have to take the data away from the individual. So where are you going to process it? On device or in your cloud? And in fact, it's much, much easier to do it on device in many respects. Even complicated AI can be done there. And then, and this does lead to my own business, but choose what we would call your data facilitator. That's a generic name for application that helps individuals get their data and then share it. We're one, obviously there are others. And once you do that, one of the nice things about the previous step was, this is, when you're asking the individual, it's fully ethical, but it also covers off many of your legal steps, for example, consent and data tracing, auditability. So it is as simple as choosing your data, where are you going to process it, the algorithm you're going to use, and the data facilitator that you need.
Thank you. Richard, anything to weigh in on that?
Yeah, just following up on Julian's point, I think if you want to catch one of the big trend lines of this decade, it's going to be data localization, right? So we're used to this concept of the data being someplace in the cloud, which the cloud providers have done a very good job of selling to us. And the compliance structures, the laws are built around that. The idea that there's somebody needs to protect your data sitting out someplace on a server farm, maybe breached, maybe hacked, maybe made available to data brokers. If the data is local, that means the computation moves to where I am. And it gives me as the client much more agency over that arrangement. And it means that the access can be created through tools like what Julian's company is providing in ways that give me the opportunity to ultimately control that relationship. And then so a key for a company then is to understand it's not about owning the data, controlling the data on their terms. It's about providing the terms of access to the data the customer already has residing locally on their device or some other way geographically close to them.
Just to add to that, Richard, of course, if you do that, the individual is likely to share more data with you because there is less risk to the individual from the promulgation of that data.
Thank you, gentlemen. Step 4 is powering up the analytical AI engine. And there I want to recommend a book. There's a great book, I think it's a 2018 book, entitled Prediction Machines. And it will take you through the process, but the key insight that I got from that book was that the cost of using algorithms today to make millions of rapid predictions and recommendations in real time in any company. So for example, predicting what to offer the client or predicting what the client is likely to want is plummeting to zero. And that's why algorithms are everywhere. They're in farms, they're in factories, and now they need to be in the luxury industry, in the luxury goods and services industry. But tell us, Richard, because you were at Google, tell us a little bit, without sharing any confidential data, about how you power up the analytical AI engine, the process of using AI powerfully.
Yeah, so at Google, of course, the main AI people are familiar with in the consumer context is Google Assistant, right? Which is now on a bunch of devices. It's on your handset and powers basically much of the interactions between Google and the environment. Much as I mentioned, data moving locally, I think another trend line to be aware of and to take advantage of is, as Milton just mentioned, the democratization of AI. There's going to be many more opportunities for people to utilize bots and personal AIs even that serve their interests and interact with the institutional AIs that Google and Facebook and Amazon and many others are putting into our environment. So it's an opportunity to think about analytics on top of the data, where again, the end user is more in control. They're more in charge of that conversation, of the way that the data is being utilized, sifted on their behalf. And so you have an opportunity as potentially using them as a client or a customer to take advantage of those technology trend lines.
So thank you, Richard. Julian, tell us a little bit about what this will look like. Am I going to have an app for each brand? Am I going to have a super app? What does that powering up of the analytical engine, how does it work in your eyes?
So you don't have to have an app for each brand, but there's no doubt that this ability to ask me for detailed data is going to deepen our relationships with the brands we trust the most. And you probably will end up with an app in that case, because you will be bringing a lot of that analytics to my data, to me. Now you've got two sides here. You've got the understanding me, and then what you do with that understanding, which you might be doing back at base. You've got to extract that understanding from the data to drive your value exchange, and that's what the algorithm is for. I will point out that when you've got really rich data, actually, you don't have to do quite as much AI as you might have to do if your data is not quite as rich. So, for example, to calculate my free cash flow, you just need to add up my credits and debits and subtract one from the other. If you want to know whether I'm sleeping well, it's no more than the basic calculation of mean, median, and standard deviations for my sleep totals each day. What you do with it may then require a more complicated set of processing. So a lot of that can be done very simply, done today on my data on my device, and only results sent back for more detailed processing. So think about the algorithms, but don't always think that it has to be complicated. It can be a combination of fairly simple data feature extraction from the data if you've got this rich data that you've now got. You don't have to try and use data that isn't really suited to the purpose to try and find out something about me. You can find out data that is suited to the purpose, and it's easier to use.
That's a brilliant point, because when you do have a relationship, you don't need to make so many predictions, because the client is telling you, often in real time, or you can derive very quickly from a quick query, what you should be using to serve the client now. And so thank you, that's a great point that simple queries will often do. Now, once you put together the right data, the ethical framework, the technology framework, the analytical, not just AI framework, then you can begin to sort of turbocharge that continuous customer value innovation platform. So tell us a little bit about that, Richard. Take a shot at it. At Google, for example, how do you create that flow?
Well, it's interesting. I think about this as a systems analyst in terms of feedback flows, right? Negative and positive feedback. And so Google and many of the other large platform providers have a certain way they control the feedback. I call it the seam cycle, right? So they surveil, they extract, they analyze, and then the M is manipulate, which frankly is a lot of what they do, and even more so as time has gone on. And so this seam cycle is based on data that they have gathered, often surreptitiously without the user's knowledge. And then, as Julian just mentioned, the analytics is basically creating inference engines. How do you figure out your best possible guesses of what somebody is doing or wants in the future? And then you use that as the basis to try to sell advertising or marketing or branding to that individual. That's to my way of thinking, that's not a great system. And there's so much room for improvement, which is why if you come back to the basics of trust, then you could have a feedback loop system where it's constantly based on you're extracting, quote unquote, information and data from a client willingly. They're giving it to you because they can start to see glimmers of the mutual benefit involved. And as time goes on and you provide more services and the trust builds, that feedback cycle becomes rich and richer and denser, and more of that information that is shared can be turned into value that's mutual between the two of you. So I think this idea of creating these sort of virtuous feedback cycles in ways that the platform companies today cannot and have not is really key to the thinking process here.
Thank you, Richard. Julian, what about building that customer value innovation platform, that continuous flow of value exchange? Tell us a little more how you see it.
So Richard talked about the seam cycle. I always talk about the OODA loop, which comes from the military, which is observe, orientate, decide, and act. But it is a loop. This is the point. So the key insight from the work we've been doing over the last few years with brands and others doing this is start. And I mean start. You need to learn in the field. You can spend too much time over analyzing on paper. Well, if I did this and then I did that and then I did that. This is a different world, actually asking the individual. You will get a different response from your individual depending upon the trust, the brand, and the history that you've got with them. So you can trial with apps very quickly. One of the nice things about apps, rather than having to change your back end systems, is they're quick to trial. And you don't have to put it out to everybody. You can put it out with a subset of your community, even sometime 50 or 100 will work, and then thousands, and then go from there to learn. So we've had the previous steps of selecting your data, which I said was all about the value exchange and the algorithms and stuff. But do a little bit of planning, but then try something, because there is absolutely no substitute to asking somebody and learning, did you ask in the right manner? Did you make it clear what you were doing in the right manner? Did you get the data you needed, etc.? And then iterate from there. So probably the key insight is to start and don't overanalyze.
Thank you. I think that's a very powerful message, that a lot of executives think that gaining that privileged access to personal data and then beginning to execute advanced personalization is complicated. Now, I'm not going to say it's easy, but it's pretty simple in its steps if you're willing to have that discipline. And part of the discipline is step 6, to implement a new customer communication strategy. Overlaying all of this technology, all of this AI, all of this data exchange, we believe something that is the essence of culture is emotional intelligence. That we need to still engage with expertise, with deep empathy, asking the right questions. It's super powerful. And then listening to really understand what the client is saying to us, earning that trust, and then having the generosity to respond with the right solution, or if we can't offer a solution, with the right response. And so we believe that the customer experience in the future, some of it will be automated because there are some tasks that computers and AI can execute in 1/10 of a second. And then there are some tasks for which the human is best suited. I have a friend, his name is Ian Henderson, and we both know this gentleman very well in Scotland. And Ian will always remind me that in a real estate transaction, there's probably 15 steps, and 9 of them are about exchanging information, and that those could be automated, but that there are other steps for which only a human interaction filled with emotional intelligence can really serve the best purpose. So I think in the future, we'll be able to decide with the customer which elements of the customer journey, of the customer experience, can be automated and which require human interaction, and how do we create a seamless, powerful experience out of all of that. I'll leave it there unless you gentlemen have some insights that you want to share on the implementing that customer communication strategy. Anything from you, Julian?
We've talked about it, but I'll just be very quick and say it's about the trust, and that you're now working together. You're actually explicitly saying you're working together in an open and transparent manner. And then that allows you the access to the data and the things that you need to do that journey. That's the difference.
And Richard, what about communication?
Yeah, I'll just add a concept that I've been exploring with my GLIAnet project, and that's something I call PEP. So it's protect, enhance, and promote. So part of it is understanding what the customer is looking for. In many ways in the digital world today, people are just looking to be protected. They want to make sure that the bad guys aren't out there getting access to their data. So that could be a very fundamental, basic way of thinking about creating that initial relationship or that initial value exchange. Enhancement is the next level, and that's more about something that exists currently that I want to get more of, enhancing aspects of my data flows, for example. And then the third part is promotion, which is actually new. It's bringing new things into my world, expanding, broadening my boundaries. So these are roughly 3 ways, based on some psychology I've been reading up on, of creating this sort of a tiered aspect. And it goes back and forth, and it also leads back to the feedback loops I mentioned earlier. So these are some of the ways to try to talk to your customers and find out, do they slot into one of these or other kinds of categories you come up with? Figure out where their needs and wants are, and then how you can start to build from there.
Thank you, Richard. And this reminds me that Katie and I spoke to a private banker the other day who told us that in his company, whenever a client starts, the first thing they do is a cybersecurity audit, that protection element. And then they begin to concern themselves with his or her financial life. But that level of protection is starting to be a different differentiator for them. And they feel that the clients gain a level of trust. They gain a level of trust with the client based on the fact that the first thing they do is offer a cybersecurity audit, and then a layer of cybersecurity protection for the family and for the client. So thank you. Let me go to step 7, which is once you have steps 1 to 6 into a smooth workflow, and usually that takes 3 or 4 months. But so it's not a long-term thing because as Julian said, you start simple, you start powerful, and you keep experimenting. How do you then create that experimental engine, what we call that pilot testing and learning experimentation? Julian, how do you get that process going? How do you create that flywheel effect?
So if you've got an app, if you're testing for the data, then you should always, so you're testing a piece, get it started, you're moving forwards. Then you can now start with small subsections of your community to start to trial other pieces to add on, because it gets easier and easier and easier for individuals. Once an individual started sharing data with you and got some value, right, it is relatively easy to say to them, well, what about this? Because I can do this now for you. So it becomes easier and easier. So you need to keep yourself having a group that you can test with and keep ahead. Now, there's all sorts of different ways you can do that in this modern world, and the tech community is well versed in this with A/B testing sometimes, with having communities that do beta versions of your apps, so you can always get ahead of the curve, etc. There's many of those, and your own teams will know that. But it just becomes easier once you've started. So again, it's a bit like point 5 in that way. Start, then push something through to production, but then keep starting new tests and experiments as you're going forwards.
Thank you. And Richard, I read that Google at any one time can have thousands of projects going on at the same time. Some companies can't even get 2 or 3 going. So what's some advice that you would share with companies to get that flywheel effect going, to become this sort of experimental client relationship building engine?
Well, I think one of the ways it's easier for Google, ironically, is because they have users. They don't have customers. And so, as Julian mentioned, this notion of A/B testing, the A/B testing treats the user as an object of the test, right? It is the experimentation upon that individual in terms of how they react to particular things put in front of them. My advice would be to treat your customer as a partner in the experimentation, a partner in the loop, as opposed to the object of the loop itself. And it is more intense in terms of you're going to have to get deeper into that relationship. So you can't have thousands of tests going on simultaneously. You're going to have to really drill down and make them, but they're value-based, right? And that's the difference. So maybe you only have a relative few, but those, in my way of thinking, are actually better than the thousands of A/B tests where I am the object of that particular transaction involving a platform company.
Thank you.
I would agree with all of that and say it, but in the sense that you've got to have this community that you're testing with, and you keep experimenting, because you have to experiment, because these are new value exchanges, and how you ask for the data can be as important as what you're going to do with it.
Interesting. And I will say this, there is a tremendous opportunity in step 8 to reorganize your teams for advanced personalization. And let me share what I mean. Right now, companies are structured for products and then channels. So they're although they claim they're customer-centric, the way they're organized in terms of departments, it's product managers and channel managers. Oh, I manage e-commerce, I manage the stores, etc. So they're siloed out. One recommendation that comes back from the early days of CRM, where we wanted the promise of CRM to really emerge, was to have customer segment managers, so that you really become a customer-centric entity and you give the power to make decisions to customer segment managers. And these customer segment managers become the stewards of the client relationships. Different types of client relationships, things tend to cluster, so you can hire, for maybe families or individuals who are single, or whatever segments come naturally to your category, your type of product or service. And then these customer segment managers, the leaders, they refocus the enterprise from products and channels right back to the individual. And I think that's where you can have that dialogue. So Richard or Julian, anything to weigh in on the potential reorganization of teams for advanced personalization? Richard?
Yeah, I'll just throw in there from my extensive experience in the corporate world, first with MCI and then later with Google. It was always surprising to me how often that the corporate departments and bureaucracies and silos don't really align with the basic needs of customers and clients. And in part, going back to the Google example, when you look at somebody as a user, I think that maybe that you can get away with that. But it uses some systems thinking. A lot of the way companies have been established is this very linear thought process around services and products. So one way, push it out the door, see what they do with it kind of approach. I think if you bring a little bit of dynamic thinking around relationship, it changes that. And so, yeah, the idea of having a particular like emissary, say within the company who's supposed to align with the interests of the customer is one way. I would also just think about, are there more fundamental ways of changing the way you provide services? So isn't this sort of almost traditional industrial-based approach of products and services? It's more about these relational constructs. It's more about a dynamic interaction with people as a way to try to extract more value.
Thank you. Julian, anything to add on that?
Well, the fleet of foot will win. So if your processes and your organizations is such that you can't do what we've been recommending of getting on with it and experimenting and moving forwards, then somebody else will win the day, because it's no longer data silos. I've got my data, I can win on that basis or whatever. It is now ubiquitous capability, so therefore you need to be fleet of foot. So whatever you need to do to make that happen within your organization is one of the key things.
Thank you. And step 9 we have as scaling up and measuring what works. And two of the most interesting concepts that make me so excited about this journey from privileged access of personal data to advanced personalization is that economists tell us that you can achieve 2 types of economies. The first is economies of scale, that because of this rich access to data, AI, and reorganizing, you can achieve scale where you can have many, many more clients. For example, a private banker, instead of having only 50 clients, may have 100 clients. And yet they're being served far better now than they were before. So that's economies of scale. That's an old industrial age metric that you can scale. So you can get bigger, better, faster. But the most interesting one is economies of scope, where your share of wallet, as we call it in retail, or your share of client portfolio, as we might say in a private bank, or your share of trips, whatever it is, the scope of the client relationship can be improved dramatically as well. So not only do you get economies of scale, but you get economies of scope. And so when we talk about measuring what works, we have a lot of industrial age metrics today. We talk about conversion and average transaction value and retention, and those are still going to be valid. But what we see in the future is examples of different metrics, such as we'll be able to measure the level of trust we have with each client. And we'll be able to see that with proxies. How much data, how much of the right data are they willing to share with us? Levels of access to the most relevant data will be a key metric. And we'll also see, because we're going to inject algorithms into the space, we're going to see algorithm prediction effectiveness. Are these algorithms effective at doing the tasks that we're asking them to do in terms of predictions? Are they right? And then we're going to see other measures of customer relationship length, depth, and loyalty. And one of the ways that we'll measure loyalty, and it'll be a very fine metric, and for luxury will be a critical metric, will be the number of referrals and the quality of referrals that we're getting from our clients. So we see this whole new level of scale up and measuring what works and creating brand new metrics. Right now we measure customer satisfaction. We'll be able to ask the customer directly, how much value are we creating for you? And their behaviors in staying with us and using us more deeply and in referring, we'll be able to understand the depth, length, and loyalty of a client relationship far better. Gentlemen, do you have anything to add on scaling up and measuring that works? Richard?
Yeah, I think, again, one of the ironies of the 21st century is this concept of big data, right? Massive amounts of data, huge flows, and these advanced analytics, AIs that are doing amazing stuff. Well, one of the reasons we have that is because it's being aimed at users, right? Transitory individuals who come and go from the platforms, who treat it, and the companies treat this in turn as a transaction, as a one-off in many cases. Obviously, they want to create relationship. They want some value, endurance to people keep coming back. but it's a very different situation or proposition than having a client. So as Julian alluded to earlier, you don't need to have the big data set. You don't have to have the massive analytics. If you have a core set of customers, that is your competitive advantage today. And gleaning the appropriate information from them in an agile fashion with the experimentation, iteration we've talked about, that's where you can find the value that frankly the platform companies under their current business models can't get to.
Thank you. Julian?
So it's interesting that in the modern world, I deliberately have a very wide open Android phone. I use Google services. So you could think that I have a deep relationship with Google. They certainly have masses of data, but they think I'm a 28-year-old female, right? Because I buy stuff for my daughter and my wife. So despite their masses of data and their AI, they've got one section fine they can advertise. So I buy good Christmas presents for my wife, but not much else. So you're absolutely right, Milton. The economy of scope, the depth of trust is now, we do have a proxy. It's the number and the depth of the data, the real data about me that I'm prepared to share. You can measure trust for the first time, right? And you go on from there. So I think in this new world, you will actually be able to measure the real parameters that add to real value for you as a business and me as an individual.
Thank you. And step 10 is about innovating and iterative testing and learning customer experience culture and processes, and with the intent to build true client relationships. So Richard, I know that culture is really important to you. Tell us about fiduciary culture. Reiterate that again and give us a couple of examples.
Yeah, so fiduciary culture, to me, in many ways, brings a lot of this together. And it ultimately comes down to creating an entity that's founded on ethical principles where they treat the human beings as customers, clients, patrons, et cetera, based on trustworthiness, based on also recourse. So there's a place they can go if they're unhappy or they have follow-up questions, so they get the appropriate support. In the world of the common law, fiduciaries goes back hundreds of years. It's actually fairly well known in many of the countries around the world. It's not just an English common law concept. The duty of care is the most fundamental, basically says, don't harm me. And this aligns back to the PEP framework I suggested, which is protect. So if you're protecting me, you're making sure that I'm not being harmed by third parties who may want to do damage to me, my reputation, my data flows. And then, so that's the core element of a fiduciary relationship. The do no harm standard that doctors, for example, operate under, the Hippocratic Oath. Above that, then, is to not have any conflicts of interest. So if you're working with me as a client, you're not at the same time trying to take some money under the table from somebody else to sell you a vacation somewhere that you know that I don't want it to take, but you're trying to convince me. So that's an example of violating that concept of a duty without conflicts, and that's the enhanced element of what I call in the PEP framework. And the highest is to promote the best interest. So affirmatively take on the client's best interest as yours. You're always in their shoes, trying to figure out as best you can on their behalf. And that's the promote function. So fiduciary law, I think, is rich, deep, and it's basically this notion of entrusted power, relationships between individuals and entities. And I feel like it's really the way to supercharge a lot of this thinking around business models, feedback loops, et cetera.
Thank you. So I want to ask you, I think it's important for you guys to leave the final takeaways. What are the key takeaways that our listeners should take away? One or two, Julian, about how we achieve this highly profitable journey from privileged access to advanced personalization.
So we've all got a great opportunity, and that opportunity is to have deeper, richer, trustful relationships. And as I opened up and said, the key actually is the value proposition, to ensure that you understand what value you're going to provide for the data that you want. All data is now available, and it's actually very simple from a customer perspective now to make that data available. So if you can find the right value propositions with the right algorithms, the right propositions, you can have the data. So the world is very open now. You now have to decide where you want to play in that, but you're not restricted, but you can have to do that with a trustful relationship, and that is by asking the customer directly.
Thank you. Richard?
So I agree with all of that. The underlying resource here isn't for, of course, personal data information, but the currency, as Milton likes to say, the currency is trust. And so here in the 21st century, we've had the web now for roughly 2 decades, and we assume that the underlying business model and the technical operation of the seam cycle I mentioned before, surveillance, extraction, analysis, manipulation, that is the best and only way to go, and that there are no alternatives. And I'm here to tell you that is completely false. That in fact, the platform companies, many of them I think increasingly are trying to figure out how to get themselves out of this business model because they're not getting the data they want. The advertisers, marketers, and branders are not particularly pleased with the current situation because they're not getting the signals they want. They're paying too much money. They're not getting transparency in the process. And of course, users increasingly are unhappy with the seam cycle approach. So I think if you think about an alternative way, based on trust, based on having a client relationship, as opposed to a one-off transactional aspect to your interactions with individuals, with people, human beings, that's a great place to start. So I would encourage you to think about some of the things we've talked about today. It comes back to ultimately building trust relationships.
Thank you. And I will end by saying, before we open up the questions, that I've been amazed by seeing so many brands struggle during, and now we could say post to some degree, as we open up pandemic. They're looking for industrial age solutions when the world has really become far more digital. And so what I will say, and I'll read this sentence, which is part of our white paper, is that post-pandemic, luxury brands are going to need new ways to vastly improve performance. And in many ways, they're looking in the wrong places. The advanced personalization techniques that we described in this webinar dramatically reduce the cost of acquiring relevant, rich, and real-time data. That's a real cost savings. They leverage the plummeting costs of AI and the use of AI, which is going down to zero. They reduce customer acquisition and retention costs. Think about all the companies that have huge customer acquisition costs and never become profitable because they can't retain their customers. Uber, Wayfair, many are out there who could use this benefit. And so the other piece is that as you can now ask the customer and have a relationship, you can reduce your supply chain and inventory costs dramatically. You can increase sustainability. And therefore your conversion, your retention, and your referral rates go up dramatically. So I think the economic and the ethical use case are compelling. They're compelling, and you can look at each one of your industries, each one of your brands, and see the benefits. So I will leave it there, but I will just say that this, if you're looking for strategic advantage, which is rarely achieved from technology, if you're looking for that competitive advantage that is highly profitable, then taking that journey from privileged access to advanced personalization is the way to go. I'm going to stop there and I'm going to hand it over to Katie. And I want to thank you, gentlemen, for your insights and for your participation and for your mission, which I think will be in the 2020s, will be recognized, you will be recognized as pioneers in this journey. So Katie, I'm going to hand it over to you for questions, please.
Great, thank you all so much. Attendees, please send any questions you have through the Q&A box. We have received several already, so I will go ahead and get started. So first of all, Milton, can you define what rich data is as opposed to, let's say, dirty data?
I'm going to hand that over to Julian because he has a whole schema as to how he defines rich data. Is that okay, Julian?
That's fine, yes. So we define rich data as your perfect data set that you always wanted. There are 5 key characteristics. Single source, so you don't have to worry about miscorrelation of different sources. Is that Julian? Is that Julian? Is that Julian? Wide or multidimensional, so across many categories, health, social, finance, purchases, etc. Deep or longitudinal in time. Sometimes that's 2-3 months. It could be lifetime for medical data. Accurate, and that's because so often data is secondhand or inferred, and you really want it from source and validated as such. And then the final one's a bit technical, but data comes in many different languages, formats, if you like, semantics or ontology for the techies. And you want to normalize that into one to make it easy to use. So rich data is single source, wide, deep, accurate, and normalized. It was impossible. It is impossible unless you go to the individual, because the individual does know and can get all the data about themselves. So we can have It's a dream of data analysts to have rich data with those 5 characteristics. That dream is no longer a dream, it's a reality if you go to the individual.
I'll just add one more piece, that a lot of data that you need to serve clients is real-time data. Maybe location data, it may be real-time browser data, and you'll never get access to that data unless you go directly to the individual and put a legal and ethical framework to protect them and then provide value for them. I'll stop there. Katie, what's the next question, please?
Richard, did you have another statement you wanted to make?
Yeah, sorry, just going to mention, one of the ironies is the platform companies tend to greatly over collect data because they don't know what's really going to be relevant for them, and that gets them into trouble. And there's even this concept of data exhaust, right? It's the data that sort of falls on the floor. Well, you don't need to have data exhaust. It can be this rich source of data that Julian's mentioning if you have a better, deeper understanding of your clients.
Thank you, Richard. I never thought that sustainability applies to data as well, right? Katie, next question. Thank you.
Great. So a few statements and then followed by a question. So value, quote unquote, is an intangible word. If you expect to measure it, you have to define it. Someone said, if you can measure it, you can control it. But before you measure it, you have to know what it is that you are measuring. So the question is, explain what is value?
Well, I'll take that first. I think value to the individual is when you've given me a benefit that I either had not anticipated I wanted or direly need or want, and you have met my needs. You have satisfied all the requirements and the criteria of what I have. For example, men's clothing. I have had relationships with brands for decades, but the only time they contact me is when they want to sell me something, when they should be anticipating that Milton's navy blue jacket is now 3 years old. Shouldn't he be in the market for one since he loves navy blue jackets? So all of these, I'll give you an example of not creating value. I bought 7 polo shirts the other day. I'm trying to help the economy and trying to get back into some little luxuries. And I signed up and I got a 15% discount from the company for providing access to my email and signing up to their newsletter. What have they done for the last few days? Spam me with offers for women's clothing. Spam me with offers that are completely irrelevant since I just bought. That is a taking away of value. And so value for me would be, they get to know me, they ask me for my data, they start helping me to dress, they help starting me to dress for occasions, they see where I'm going, and now begin to recommend places I might want to go that are similar and would add more value for me. So that's just one silly example, but it's to say that now you're trying to serve the needs, as Richard says, to protect, enhance, and promote my interests. Julian?
So yes, we use the word value very specifically, being we're from the data layer, because too many people say data is monetary and therefore your value for your data is money. It isn't. It's a service, a convenience, a reward. And that'll be different for each sector, even in the same sector from one company to another, and different individuals. So Milton's just explained his view of value. So each company needs to come up with their own value exchanges. But I want to point out how important these are, because I'll go back to a health app. If a health app that asks me for my health data and the food I eat and maybe my genomics, and even if it's a mental health app, my social data, because it's a good indicator, I'm going to share a lot of data for that, but it's going to keep me healthy, happy, alive. That's an almost indescribable value if it keeps me alive as it doesn't. And I'll even pay for the app as well. So value can be everything from staying alive to a more ephemeral, I chose the right shirt or whatever it is. So I think the company has to choose the value and to measure that value, which they can do. But you've now got the ability to provide value across the spectrum. But it's a service. To me, it's a service, it's a convenience or a reward, or it could be any combination thereof.
Thank you. Richard, anything to add to that?
Just to push back a bit on the notion of creating metrics around value. I mean, there are ways around the edges to understand the connection between what an individual values and what a company might offer as a mutual exchange of value. But that's part of, I think, the notion of advanced personalization is it's probably going to vary across the board depending on who you're dealing with, the kind of offering you're negotiating with and implementing on behalf of that end user. So maybe some metrics don't get you there. The ultimate metric may simply be, at the end of the day, satisfied customers.
Thank you. And they will let you know with their voting. They'll vote with their wallet and their time. Katie, what's the next question, please?
Sure. The question is for all of you, actually. What advice would you give to startups for implementing advanced personalization strategies?
Richard, you take that one, Julian, and I'll go last if I have anything valuable to add.
Okay. Well, Julian's probably better situated than I am since I tended to work in larger companies, but based here in Silicon Valley, I can say that, the idea oftentimes in startups, the early days, is you need to find sort of the compelling business proposition, the service, the offering, the product, and then find your customers and then try to create those connections. I would try to think about it, again, from the other way around a bit. What are the compelling needs you see out there in terms of the customers you're already trying to serve or that you want to serve? And then build the technologies into that. The technologies in many ways is just the layering on top of the needs, the wants, the value exchange we've been talking about. So don't focus so much on cool new tech, cool new applications. What are the needs and wants out there? And the tech can always sort of come along for the ride.
Thank you, Julian.
So actually, you're in a very good place as a startup, and this is a challenge for all companies now, in that up until recently, there's been an asymmetry of data to allow you to do things. So some big companies have had the data, and as a startup, your problem has been you've got a great idea, but you haven't had the data to provide that value from it. That's now disappeared. So you can go and use any data facilitator like us to now be able to ask your future customers for their data and create a new service. And data is no longer your problem. So your problem now is, have you got a need? As Richard said, have you got a need? Are you addressing something? You can move out very, very fast because you haven't got to build connections to all the data pipes. You haven't got to achieve all the legal agreements for the data pipes. You haven't got to have umpteen different authentications and processes. You're just going to the individual. Now that just means you've got to have a good value proposition because I'm sharing my data with you. But provided you've got that, as a startup, actually your life is much, much easier now than it was 2, 3, 4 years ago when there was a huge data asymmetry and you couldn't get the data to do what you need. So today is your day.
And I just want to add something that you guys had mentioned before. You no longer have to extract the data from the device of the client. You can help the client. I always think of wines and spirits companies. Why don't you try to be my digital sommelier and help me aggregate all the data in all the consumption I've had of wines and spirits? Or as I said to 1,000 real estate advisors recently, why don't you create for your buyers and sellers a personal database where you help them aggregate all of the documents related to their home ownership? Everything, the purchase, the upgrades, anything you bought related to the home, tax issues, implications, become their personal data steward for your category as a start. And a startup can do that very easily because you don't even have to hold your data. You can use advanced AI, on-device AI, to not extract their data. And that, I think, is an opportunity that has never been available before. Okay, next question.
So this is our final question. The question is very specific around what brands can do right now to actually prepare to take these steps. So it's one thing to actually follow the steps. It's another thing to prepare to take the steps. So can you explain a little bit about what brands need to do to prepare, and then a little bit into what the timeline and the cost is around doing something such as this?
Okay, I'm going to start by saying that the reason I've gathered Julian and Richard is because we now do consulting for brands, and I had to bring in top experts from outside the luxury industry. So we're available to give you help, and we can certainly have a dialogue with you that costs nothing. But there will be a cost to getting your people together in a room to brainstorm what data is required. There will be a cost to then figuring out the legal and ethical framework, but I think any great attorney working aside for you can help you do that, especially since you're doing the right thing, right? You're going to exceed what the legal requirements are, and that will not be onerous. That will only inspire people to share your data more. Establishing the technology framework is more complex, and there an expert like Julian or other experts can help you to do that. And then I think just following the rest of the steps to become a highly agile organization, like many companies have done, outside the luxury industry, outside many industries, where you see Googles of the world and the Facebooks of the world create a really, like what I would call a data and analytical engine process within the business. My estimate is it takes 4 months from that brainstorming session to putting together simple elements that allow you to begin to start to create value and to test and experiment your way into it. Now I'm going to stop there, but Julian, and why don't you take a shot at it also, please?
Well, we provide, as I've said before, the sort of the infrastructure layer. We're what was called the personal data grid for the individuals, decentralized, each individual holds it. So actually, it's not our job to help people use us, if you like. And so therefore, in this particular instance, I would say you should go out. There are now groups of people who are developing the expertise and the processes. Milton's, I will say, from all of our experience, is definitely in the lead in this area in terms of making it a process, and it is a simple process to do. So just start, and I come back to that again. You can overthink this. Just start the process, realizing that you can now go to the consumer, and you'll find that process then flows very quickly itself. But seek out people that can provide the advice, like the Luxury Institute and others, and just start the process.
Thank you. Richard, I'll give you the last word on that.
Well, I think every good company has a mission statement, right? So I think I would just on day one, just go to the mission. It has something to do with, I'm sure, providing value, mutual benefit, satisfying your customers, and think about it through the prism of some of the things we've talked about today. As Milton mentioned, it's not difficult, but it also requires, a careful thought process and putting the right things in the right order. But I think you can get there with the appropriate mindset in terms of ultimately serving your market segment.
And then finally, I'll say that taking this journey will have an initial investment, but the cost savings are dramatic. And I, again, take you to a book called Prediction Machines, and there's others out there that will help you understand the new economics of this personal data economy. I want to thank you, Richard. I want to thank you, Julian. You are people I admire truly and have learned tremendous amounts from. And I recommend that you guys look them up, GLIAnet and digi.me, and follow them, because I think they are way on the leading edge of what's going to transform you in the 2020s. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you again, Richard and Julian, and we'll see you on the next webinar. All the best.